In 1880, more Americans worked in the ice industry than in the entire American steel industry. Not ice cream, not ice sculpture. Ice. Blocks of frozen water, cut by hand from ponds and lakes every winter across New England and the Great Lakes, packed into sawdust, loaded onto ships and railroad cars, and delivered to homes, hospitals, hotels, and meat-packing operations in cities as far away as Calcutta, India, and Havana, Cuba. The industry moved 25 million tons of ice per year at its peak. It employed 90,000 men seasonally. It had its own tool manufacturers, its own purpose-built rail cars, its own engineering traditions, and its own way of reading a winter that took experienced men years to acquire, and then it vanished so completely that most people alive today have never heard its name. This is how Americans built and ran the largest perishable goods logistics system in history, before mechanical refrigeration existed. The man who started it was named Frederick Tudor. He was born in Boston in 1783, the son of a judge, and in the winter of 1805 he came up with an idea that every person he told it to considered proof of insanity. He was going to cut ice from the ponds of Massachusetts and ship it to the Caribbean. His business diary, held at the Harvard Business School Baker Library in Boston, records the reactions he got. A friend wrote in his own journal that Frederick Tudor had proposed a new species of madness. The Boston Gazette ran a small item noting the plan with what reads, "Even at 2 centuries of distance," as barely suppressed laughter. Nobody who heard the plan believed it would work, because everyone who heard it understood immediately that ice melts, and ice shipped to the tropics would be water by the time it arrived. Tudor understood this too. What he also understood, and what nobody else had yet worked out, was that ice melts slowly when insulated correctly, and the question was not whether the ice would survive the journey, but how much of it would survive, and whether the portion that survived was enough to make the business work. His first shipment left Boston Harbor on February 10th, 1806. The brig Favourite carried 130 tons of ice, cut from Fresh Pond in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Tudor had paid for the ice himself, hired the men who cut it himself, and negotiated the shipping himself. He arrived in Martinique with about 100 tons still frozen. The problem he had not solved was that nobody in Martinique knew what to do with it. The island had no ice houses. The locals had no experience storing ice. They were not entirely sure why a man had brought a shipload of frozen pond water to a tropical island, and when he tried to sell it, the ice was gone before the buyers understood what they had purchased. Tudor lost nearly $5,000 on that first trip. In 1806, that was close to a year's wages for a skilled tradesman. He went back again anyway. His diaries from the years between 1806 and 1820 read like a ledger of disasters. Shipments that arrived too late in the season and melted on the dock. Ice houses built in the wrong locations too far from the ports. Business partners who took his money and disappeared. Creditors who had him briefly imprisoned for debt in 1812. A second imprisonment in 1813. What the diaries also record, in the same flat accounting tone, is that every year he went back, the losses got smaller. He was learning, and the learning was specific. He learned that sawdust was the best insulation for ice because it was dry and available everywhere. He learned that a well-insulated ice house in a tropical climate could preserve 50% of its contents through a summer. He learned that the key to profitability was not reducing melt entirely, but reducing it enough that the delivered ice could be priced at a margin that covered the total loss from start to finish. By 1820, Frederick Tudor had turned a profit for the first time. By 1833, he was shipping ice to Calcutta. By 1856, his business was worth over $1 million, which in 1856 represented roughly 1/2 of 1% of the entire federal government's annual budget. Boston newspapers had stopped laughing. They had started calling him the Ice King. What Tudor had done without entirely planning to was prove that a product that could not be manufactured had an industrial-scale market. The ice was free. Winter made it every year, reliably, in the ponds and lakes of New England and the upper Midwest. The only cost was cutting it, storing it, and moving it. And once he had proved the market existed, other men moved in to solve the cost. The ice harvest, as a systematic industrial operation, developed between roughly 1840 and 1870, and it developed fastest in the places where the winter was cold enough and the access to water and rail was good enough to support large-scale operations. The Hudson River was one of those places. The river freezes solidly in most winters between Poughkeepsie and Albany, and by the 1860s a series of large ice companies had established operations along its banks, The Knickerbocker Ice Company, which would become the largest ice operation in the world by the 1880s, ran out of Rockland Lake above Haverstraw and employed several hundred men in peak season. The Knickerbocker's operations on the Hudson are documented in the New York State Archives and in a series of articles published by Scientific American in 1884 that amount to the best contemporary account of industrial-scale ice harvesting anywhere in the American record. The harvest began when the river froze to a consistent depth of at least 12 inches. Anything thinner than that was too dangerous to support the horse teams and the loaded sleds that the operation required. The foreman's job in the weeks before the cut was to walk the ice daily, driving an auger through the surface at different points and measuring the depth with a marked rod. A foreman who called the cut too early could lose men and equipment through thin ice. One who called it too late risked a mid-season thaw that softened the ice before the harvest was complete. When the foreman judged the ice ready, the first crew out onto the river was the marking gang. The marking gang used a tool called an ice plough. It was not a plough in the agricultural sense. It was a wooden frame fitted with a series of sharp iron teeth on its underside, drawn by a horse across the ice surface at a precise angle. The teeth cut parallel grooves into the top of the ice about 4 inches deep, spaced exactly 22 inches apart. Then the horse was turned and driven across the grooves at a right angle, cutting a second set of parallel grooves. The result was a grid of lines cut into the ice surface, each square of the grid measuring 22 inches on each side. 22 inches was the standard ice block dimension for the American market. It had not been arrived at arbitrarily. It fit the standard ice box that was sold to American households in the 1860s and 1870s, a wooden cabinet lined with tin and insulated with cork or sawdust that sat in most kitchens and was supplied by the local iceman, who came once or twice a week with a delivery. The industry had standardized on the dimension and worked backward from it to the harvest. Once the grid was marked, the cutting gangs moved in. The primary cutting tool was the ice saw. It was similar in form to a carpenter's crosscut saw, but heavier, with coarser teeth designed to cut through ice rather than wood. A man stood upright and worked the saw in long downward strokes, following the marked groove and cutting through the full depth of the ice. The saw cut was made along every second groove in one direction first, then every second groove in the other direction, leaving the ice in large rectangular sections still connected by uncut bridges of ice. These sections were then cut free one block at a time as the operation moved along the field. The Scientific American account from 1884 describes a Knickerbocker field crew working at peak pace. One marking horse moving continuously ahead of the cutters, 12 sawyers working in parallel rows, and a team of men with peavies and pike poles behind them, floating the cut blocks toward the elevator channel at the field's edge. The pace, when everything was working, was described as roughly 1 block every 4 seconds across the entire operation. Behind the cutting crews, a narrow channel had been cut from the field to the icehouse shore. The cut blocks floated in this channel, pushed along by men with pike poles until they reached the elevator, a mechanical conveyor running at an angle from the water surface up to the icehouse loading doors. The elevator was chain-driven, powered by a horse walking in a circle on the shore above. Each block rode the elevator chain upward on spiked iron cleats and was pushed off at the top by a man stationed at the unloading point. Inside the icehouse, other men stacked and packed. The packing was skilled work. An ice block set down without care left air gaps between itself and the blocks around it, and air gaps meant faster melt. A well-packed ice tier had blocks set so close together that a man could barely slide his hand between them. Sawdust was shoveled into any remaining gaps and onto every surface between layers. The top layer was buried under 18 inches of sawdust before the doors were sealed. A well-built icehouse, properly packed, could retain 60 to 70% of its contents from one winter to the following winter. The Knickerbocker's main storage complex at Rockland Lake held approximately 100,000 tons at full capacity. The New York State Archives record the complex as the largest cold storage facility in the world at the time of its peak operation in the late 1880s. 100,000 tons of ice, sitting in the dark in a wooden building waiting for summer. The man responsible for the quality of that pack was called the ice boss. His judgment on which blocks went where, which layers needed extra sawdust, whether drainage channels inside the house should run to prevent meltwater from pooling under the lower tiers and accelerating loss from below, determined how much of that 100,000 tons would still be sellable ice in August. The Knickerbocker's ice boss in the 1880s was a man named Otto Rice. He appears in the company's payroll records held in the New York State Archives, listed at a weekly wage of $14 during the harvest season and $8 during the summer distribution period. He was 41 years old in 1884, born in Bavaria, and had come to the Hudson Valley in 1868. The payroll entry beside his name carries a notation that does not appear beside any other name in the ledger. Approved by management, both seasons. His wage was roughly 3 times what a common labourer on the harvest crew earned. The gap reflects what the company had learned over 2 decades of operation about the cost of getting the packing wrong. The men who worked beneath him on the harvest floor earned between $1 and $1.75 per day depending on their role. The sawyers and the elevator men at the top of that range, the pike pole crews and the sawdust shovelers at the bottom. The work ran from before sunrise to after dark during the harvest, because the harvest window was fixed by the weather and could not be extended. A week of unexpected warmth in February could soften the ice field and end the season early. Every day of good freeze was a day that had to be used. The injuries on a working ice field were specific to the environment and specific to the tools. A man who slipped on the wet ice surface while carrying a saw could fall into an open cut channel and go under the ice. A block being moved by PV could shift and pin a man's foot against the fixed ice. The elevator chain, running under a load, could catch a sleeve or a hand. The Knickerbocker's accident records do not survive in the New York State Archives, but a study of Hudson Valley newspaper records from the 1870s and 1880s, compiled by historian Jonathan Kendall in his 1959 account of the Hudson River ice trade, identifies at least 37 deaths attributed to ice harvesting accidents in a 10-year period on the river. 37 deaths in the record. The actual number, as always in this era, was almost certainly higher. Once the ice was in the house, the second half of the operation began, getting it to the customer. The Hudson River Ice Companies sold to 2 distinct markets. The first was the residential market, the household icebox supplied by the local iceman with his horse-drawn wagon, his leather shoulder pad, and his ice tongs. The second was the commercial market, hotels, restaurants, breweries, meat-packing plants and hospitals, all of which needed ice in much larger quantities and on a more reliable schedule than the residential trade required. The residential trade was local. A river ice company sold to city distributors, who sold to neighbourhood ice dealers, who sold to households. The ice passed through 3 hands before it reached the kitchen, and at each hand a margin was added. By the time a 22-inch block arrived at a New York City household in July of 1880, it had started as free river water and passed through a logistics chain that employed drivers, warehouse men, canal boat crews, and a small army of icemen who knew every street in their territory and every customer by name. The commercial trade, particularly the beer industry, was what drove the economics of the inland harvest. American lager brewing expanded dramatically in the 1870s and 1880s as German immigrant brewers established operations in Milwaukee, Cincinnati, St. Louis, and Chicago. Lager, unlike ale, requires cold fermentation. The yeast that produces lager's characteristic flavour and clarity works best at temperatures between 35 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit. In the era before mechanical refrigeration, the only way to achieve those temperatures in a commercial brewery was ice. A large brewery in Milwaukee in 1880 consumed between 10,000 and 15,000 tons of ice per year. That ice came primarily from the lakes of Wisconsin and Minnesota, harvested by crews that operated on the same principles as the Hudson River operations, but at a scale suited to the flat terrain and the railroad access of the Midwest. The Chicago and Milwaukee breweries were the largest single customers in the ice trade. The Pabst Brewing Company's purchasing records, cited in Thomas Cochrane's 1948 History of the Company, show ice purchases running to several thousand tons per season through the 1880s, with contracts placed in the fall for the following winter's harvest before the ice had even formed. The railroad made this scale possible. An ice block cut in Wisconsin in January, and destined for a brewery in Chicago, had to survive a rail journey of approximately 90 miles in a car that was not refrigerated in any mechanical sense. The car was insulated, packed with sawdust around the ice cargo, and sealed. Ice shipped in this way lost roughly 10 to 15% of its mass in a 90-mile journey, which the economics of the trade had long since incorporated into the pricing. The rail car specifications for ice transport were published by the Railroad Gazette in 1878, as a technical note on best practices for perishable freight. The car was a standard boxcar with an additional inner skin of wood separated from the outer walls by 4 inches of sawdust packing. The floor was elevated on wooden runners to allow meltwater drainage through vents at the car's base. The ceiling was similarly packed, A fully loaded and sealed ice car, the Gazette noted, would retain approximately 85% of its cargo on a 2-day journey in summer conditions. 85% retained over 2 days meant the trade could reach markets at significant distances, and it did. Western beef, packed in ice cars, reached eastern cities from Chicago in the early 1880s for the first time, giving Gustavus Swift and Philip Armour the cost advantage that broke the eastern meatpacking monopolies and shifted the centre of the American beef industry to the Midwest. The ice that made the refrigerator car possible was not manufactured. It was cut from the lakes of Minnesota and Wisconsin by men earning $1.50 a day and packed into standard 22-inch blocks by crews who had been doing the same work the same way for 20 years. The connection between the ice harvest and the dressed beef revolution is not a detail most histories of the American food industry record. The refrigerator car gets the credit. The ice inside the car is a footnote if it appears at all. It was not a footnote at the time. The ice trade in the 1880s was large enough and visible enough that it attracted speculators the way any large, reliable market attracts them. The companies that had grown up around specific rivers and lakes had become, by the mid-1880s, substantial businesses with real estate, equipment and distribution networks that represented significant capital. The American Ice Company, formed in 1899 through a series of mergers of Hudson River ice operators, was capitalized at $60 million. For context, that figure represented roughly 1/3 of the total annual budget of the United States government in 1899. The American Ice Company's formation was immediately followed by an attempt to corner the New York City ice market, raising prices for residential ice delivery by 40% in the spring of 1900. The attempt was covered extensively by New York newspapers and became a political issue when it emerged that the company had secured favorable dock leases from Tammany Hall in exchange for stock. New York Governor Theodore Roosevelt intervened. The leases were revoked. The price increase was reversed. The American Ice Company survived but never regained the market position it had held before the scandal. The scandal is remembered, when it is remembered at all, as a footnote in Roosevelt's biography. The ice trade that produced it is not remembered at all. What killed the ice trade was not scandal. It was the ammonia compression refrigerator. The principle of mechanical refrigeration, using the compression and expansion of a gas to transfer heat, was demonstrated by Jacob Perkins in 1834 and had been refined in various industrial applications through the middle of the 19th century. The first practical ammonia compression systems for commercial use appeared in the 1870s, initially in large breweries that could justify the capital cost of the equipment and the engineering expertise required to operate it. The Schlitz Brewing Company installed its first mechanical refrigeration system in Milwaukee in 1880. The Pabst plant followed in 1882. The capital cost was high enough that small operations could not afford it. But for a brewery consuming 15,000 tons of ice per year, the arithmetic changed quickly once the price of the equipment came down and the reliability of the systems improved. By 1890, mechanical refrigeration was established in every major American brewery. The ice trade's largest single customer base had gone. The residential and commercial food markets took longer. The household icebox remained in common use through the 1920s and into the 1930s in many parts of the country, and the local iceman remained a familiar figure in American cities, well past the point where mechanical refrigeration had captured the commercial trade. The transition was not sudden or uniform. It moved at the pace of capital. The large operations converted first, the small and the residential last. The natural ice trade peaked in production terms around 1890, when total American harvest was estimated by the United States Census of Manufactures at approximately 25 million tons per year. By 1900, that figure had begun to fall. By 1910, it had fallen sharply. By 1920, the industrial-scale river ice operations of the Hudson Valley and the Great Lakes were mostly idle. The men who worked them had moved on to whatever else there was. The ice houses themselves came down slowly. The Knickerbocker complex at Rockland Lake was partially demolished in the 1920s as the land was converted to other uses. Some of the smaller Hudson River houses survived into the 1940s as storage buildings before rot and neglect took them. The ice channels cut into the riverbanks silted over. The elevator foundations weathered down to the waterline. What is left now is almost nothing visible. A few stone foundation remnants along the Hudson banks that a person who knows what they are looking at can identify. A collection of ice harvesting tools in the Farmers Museum in Cooperstown, New York, including several ice saws, a pair of ice tongs, and a horse-drawn ice plough. The Harvard Business School Baker Library has Frederick Tudor's business diaries, which are available to researchers by appointment. Otto Rice does not have a museum exhibit. His payroll record is in a box in the New York State Archives in Albany. There is a question the records do not answer, because nobody thought to ask it at the time. The men who worked the ice harvest in the 1880s and 1890s were working an industry they knew was finite. Mechanical refrigeration was not a secret. The breweries were converting. The trade press covered it. A man who spent January of 1888 working a pike pole on the Hudson River ice field, pushing blocks toward the elevator channel at $1.50 a day, could read, if he could read, that the Pabst and Schlitz breweries had stopped buying natural ice 2 years before. Did they know what was coming? The payroll records and the accident reports do not answer that. The men in those records are names beside wage figures, most of them immigrants from Germany, Sweden, Ireland, and Italy. Most of them working whatever seasonal labour was available and moving between trades as the seasons changed. A man who worked the Hudson ice harvest in January might work construction in April, farming through the summer, and railroad maintenance in the fall. The ice trade was one season among several for most of them. The loss of it was the loss of one season's income, not the collapse of a lifetime's specialization. The men who did specialize, the ice bosses like Otto Rice, the foreman who could read ice thickness and judge a pack and run a harvest crew of 200 men, those men had skills that transferred nowhere. What Otto Rice knew about ice, he had spent 20 years learning. When the industry went, that knowledge went with him. His payroll entry in the Knickerbocker Ledger stops in 1891. The industry did not collapse until the early 1900s, so the stop is not explained by the trade's decline. He may have retired. He may have died. He may have moved to another operation that did not use the same payroll system. The New York State Archives record does not say. What it says is that in 1884, he was earning $14 a week, and the notation beside his name read, "Approved by management both seasons." He was the man who knew how to pack 100,000 tons of ice into a wooden building and keep 60% of it alive until August. That knowledge is gone. Frederick Tudor, the man who started the whole system, died in 1864, before the industry he founded reached its peak. He had seen it grow from one shipment of 130 tons to a trade that covered the eastern seaboard and reached into the tropics. His tomb is in Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a short distance from Fresh Pond, where he cut his first ice in 1806. The pond is still there. It is now a city reservoir and a public park. The city of Cambridge prohibits swimming, fishing, and ice cutting. In the winter of 1806, the ice on that pond was thick enough to cut in blocks and ship to the Caribbean. A man was there when it froze, measuring the thickness with a marked rod, deciding when it was ready. He lost nearly $5,000 on what he found, and then he went back. The logistics of moving ice from a frozen lake in Maine to a hospital in Savannah, Georgia, in the summer of 1875 required a chain of decisions, each one made by a different man in a different place, none of them in communication with each other in real time. The harvest foreman in Maine decided when the ice was ready and how long the cutting window would last. The ice house manager decided how the blocks were packed and what losses to expect through the summer. The shipping agent decided which cargo vessel or which rail line would carry the load south and what insurance to place on the shipment. The receiving warehouse in Savannah decided how to store what arrived and how to distribute it to the hospitals and hotels on their customer list. At no point in this chain did anyone have a reliable way to tell the man at the next step what had happened at the previous one. A ship delayed by weather in Boston Harbor was a ship the Savannah warehouse did not know was delayed until it arrived late or not at all. An ice house that had lost more than expected to a warm February was still quoting its summer customers the prices agreed in the fall. The system worked. To the degree it worked, because every man in the chain built in a margin. The harvest foreman cut more than the orders required because some of it would melt in storage. The icehouse manager accepted that 60% yield was a good year. The shipping agent insured for 30% loss in transit. The Savannah warehouse kept 2 weeks of reserve stock. The margin was the system. The system had no other mechanism. What this meant in practice was that the ice trade was simultaneously more efficient and more wasteful than any modern logistics operation would tolerate. Efficient because a product that was essentially free at the source could absorb enormous losses in transit and still deliver a profit. Wasteful because the losses were accepted as structural rather than solved. Nobody in the 1870s was trying to reduce ice melt in transit by 10%. The ice was cheap enough that the question was not worth asking. Frederick Tudor had understood this from the beginning. His early diaries are full of melt calculations, yield estimates, and break-even analyses that modern logistics engineers would recognize immediately. He was not doing anything different from what a supply chain manager does today. He was doing it with pen, paper, and the observations of men who had made the same trip before. The men who understood the melt calculations best were the captains of the ice schooners that ran the coastal trade between Boston and the southern ports through the 1850s and 1860s. These men were not employees of the ice companies in any formal sense. They were independent contractors who owned or leased their vessels and who negotiated cargo rates with the ice merchants for each voyage. A captain who didn't understand ice lost money on every voyage, because the payment structure in the coastal ice trade was based on delivered ice, not loaded ice. The merchant paid for what arrived, not what was put on the ship. A captain who loaded 100 tons and delivered 70 because he had not packed his hold correctly was absorbing a 30-ton loss from his own margin. The result was that the men who survived in the coastal ice trade for more than a few seasons were men who had learned, by experience and by watching experienced men, exactly how to pack an ice cargo in a ship's hold to minimize melt across a 12-day voyage to Savannah or a 4-week voyage to Havana. They packed in layers with sawdust between each layer. They kept the hold doors sealed except during loading and unloading. They ran the ship at a pace that balanced speed against the heat generated by the working rigging, because the crew's activity transmitted warmth through the deck into the hold. They chose departure times that minimized the hours in harbour, because a ship at dock in summer took on heat through the hull that a ship at sea in a breeze did not. None of this was written down in a manual. It was knowledge held by captains and passed to mates who became captains, who passed it to their own mates. The ice companies hired the experienced men at a premium and accepted that the knowledge could not be easily replaced. James Eldridge, whose name appears in the Salem Custom House records beginning in 1851, commanded ice schooners out of Wenham Lake in Essex County, Massachusetts for 17 seasons. His vessels made over 200 voyages to southern ports carrying Wenham ice, which had a reputation in the trade for its unusual clarity. Wenham ice was cut from a shallow spring-fed lake whose water was notably pure, and the resulting blocks were transparent enough that shop owners in London, where a small export trade in Wenham ice existed through the 1840s and 1850s, used them as shop window display pieces. The clarity was a marketing feature. The ice itself was the same product as the Hudson River ice or the Maine Pond ice. But in a trade where the product was invisible to the buyer until it arrived, reputation was a real asset, and Wenham Lake had built one. Eldridge retired from the ice trade in 1868, the year the first shipment of mechanical ice reached the American East Coast from a New Orleans ice manufacturing plant. He was 53 years old. His retirement is noted in a brief item in the Salem Register, which describes him as having made a comfortable competency from his years in the trade. What he had made was the knowledge of how to move frozen water 2,000 miles without losing more than 20% of it. That knowledge retired with him. The manufacturing side of the transition, the shift from harvested ice to machine-made ice, did not happen in one place or at one moment. It happened in pieces, driven by the same economics that had built the natural ice trade in the first place. The first commercially successful ice manufacturing plant in the United States opened in New Orleans in 1868, operated by the Louisiana Ice Manufacturing Company. New Orleans was the obvious market. The city was in the deep south, far from any natural ice source, dependent on expensive shipped ice that arrived in poor condition after a long sea voyage. A local ice factory that could produce ice year-round at a consistent price without the weather dependency of the natural harvest had an immediate economic advantage. The factory used an ammonia compression system to cool water in metal moulds. The blocks that came out of the moulds were not the same dimensions as the natural harvest blocks. They were denser, clearer, and more uniform. They were also more expensive per ton to produce than natural ice, a fact that the New Orleans operation's early accounts make clear. But the price advantage of local production over shipped natural ice was large enough to offset the higher production cost, and the Louisiana Ice Manufacturing Company was profitable within 3 years of opening. The key number from that early operation cited in a technical survey of American refrigeration published by the United States Department of Agriculture in 1901, was the delivery consistency. Natural ice from the north arrived when ships could deliver it, which meant that New Orleans went without ice during storms, during high-demand periods when ships were fully committed elsewhere, and during the years when the northern harvest came in short. Manufactured ice arrived when the factory ran, which was every day the equipment was maintained and the power held. Consistency was worth paying for in the food service and medical trades, where the alternative to ice was spoiled product or sick patients. The hospital market was where the transition to manufactured ice happened fastest, for exactly that reason. A hotel could manage a day without ice by adjusting its menus. A hospital treating typhoid patients in a New Orleans summer could not manage a day without ice to pack the fever patients. The medical institutions in southern cities were among the first customers to switch to manufactured ice, despite its higher price, and they locked in contracts that gave the early ice factories a reliable revenue base during the period when their equipment was still being debugged and their production costs were still high. The natural ice trade fought back in the only way it could: price. The large Hudson River companies and the New England harvesters cut their prices through the 1880s to compete with manufactured ice in the markets where manufactured ice was becoming available. The American Ice Company's price-cutting strategy in the 1890s was partly a response to competition from manufactured ice plants that had been established along the eastern seaboard in the preceding decade. The strategy bought time but could not hold the market indefinitely, because the manufactured ice plants had a structural advantage the natural trade could never overcome. They were not dependent on winter. A natural ice operation required a cold winter to produce its inventory. A warm January in the Hudson Valley meant a short harvest, thin ice, and the risk of cutting into the structural reserve that kept the previous year's stock viable. Warm winters in the 1880s and early 1890s produced several years of short supply that drove prices up sharply and pushed commercial customers toward the manufactured alternative. Each price spike accelerated the transition. The winter of 1890 to 1891 was one of those years. The Hudson froze late and thin. The Knickerbocker's harvest was roughly 60% of its normal volume. The New York market that winter paid prices for natural ice that had not been seen since the 1860s, when the trade was younger and less competitive. The breweries and the meat packers who had not yet committed to manufactured refrigeration reconsidered. Several of them did not reconsider. They converted. The Knickerbocker Ice Company itself began investing in mechanical refrigeration equipment in 1892, not to replace its harvest operations but to supplement them in the years when the river harvest came in short. By 1898, the company was producing manufactured ice year-round alongside its natural harvest. By 1905, the natural harvest had been reduced to a fraction of its former scale and was operated primarily to supply the residential icebox trade, which was the last market to convert and the one that held on longest. The last large-scale natural ice harvest on the Hudson River took place in the winter of 1924 to 1925. The Knickerbocker Ice Company, by then operating under different ownership following a series of corporate transactions in the 1910s, sent crews onto the river one final time for a harvest that was more symbolic than economic. The residential icebox trade in New York City had been largely displaced by the electric refrigerator through the early 1920s. There was no longer a market large enough to justify the operation. The men who worked that last harvest were the grandsons of the men who had built the system. Some of them had fathers who had worked the same ice fields in the 1890s. The peavies and the ice saws and the horse-drawn markers were the same tools, or the same design as the tools that had been in use since the 1860s. The knowledge of how to use them had passed through 2 generations of practice. After 1925, it stopped passing. The men who knew it had nobody to teach. The electric refrigerator entered the American home market in significant numbers after 1920. General Electric introduced the monitor-top refrigerator in 1927, a unit that sold for around $500, which was 2 to 3 months' wages for an average worker. The price came down steadily through the late 1920s and the 1930s as production scaled and competition increased. By 1940, roughly half of American urban households had a mechanical refrigerator. By 1950, the percentage was over 80. The household icebox did not vanish all at once. In rural areas and in the poorer neighborhoods of American cities, the Iceman continued to operate through the 1940s. His route shrank every year as the refrigerators went in, and the ice companies that supplied him shrank with it. Some of them converted to manufactured ice, and found a residual market in commercial applications, summer camps, and food service. Others closed. The last American Iceman delivering from a horse-drawn wagon is difficult to date precisely, because the trade faded out unevenly across different cities and different neighborhoods. The New York Times carried a brief feature in 1953 on the last commercial Iceman operating a horse-drawn delivery route in Manhattan. His name was not preserved in the article. He was described as elderly and as having been on the same route for 30 years. His customers, the article noted, were mostly elderly themselves. The people who still had an icebox were the people who had always had an icebox and had not replaced it. The Iceman himself was one of the last visible links to a system that had employed 90,000 men and moved 25 million tons of product per year at its peak. He was delivering a few £100 a week to a handful of apartments on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, in a city where mechanical refrigeration had been standard equipment for 20 years. Frederick Tudor had shipped the first ice from Boston Harbor in 1806. From that first shipment to the Manhattan Iceman's last horse-drawn delivery was approximately 150 years of an industry that built itself on a product that melts, delivered it to markets that could not have existed without it, and then disappeared so completely that the men who worked it are remembered, when they are remembered at all, as entries in payroll ledgers held in state archives that most researchers never open. Otto Rice packed 100,000 tons of ice into a wooden building every winter for at least 7 years. He kept 60% of it alive until August. The notation beside his name in the Knickerbocker ledger reads, "Approved by management both seasons." His wage was $14 a week. The pond that Frederick Tudor cut his first ice from is still in Cambridge. You can walk around it on a path maintained by the city. In January, when the temperature drops far enough, a thin skim of ice forms on the surface near the edges. It is not 12 inches thick. It would not hold a man. It would not hold a horse. It would not hold 130 tons of blocked ice ready to ship to the Caribbean. But it is the same water. The tools of the ice harvest did not disappear with the trade. They outlasted it by decades in some cases, stored in barns and sheds by men who had used them and could not quite bring themselves to discard them. An ice saw is not a specialized object in its appearance. It looks like a carpenter's saw, heavier, with coarser teeth, but recognizable as a saw. A man who did not know the ice trade could pick one up and understand what it was for. What he could not understand, without being shown, was how to use it on a field of river ice in January without splitting the blade against a subsurface crack or losing his footing on the wet surface when the saw caught. The tool is simple. The knowledge required to use it correctly is not. This distinction between the physical artifact of the trade and the working knowledge the trade required is the reason why museum exhibits of ice harvesting tools are accurate representations of what existed and incomplete representations of what the trade actually was. The saw and the peavey and the ice tongs are on display in the Farmers' Museum in Cooperstown. The knowledge of how to read an ice field at 5 in the morning in February, how to judge where the thickness was reliable and where a horse might go through, how to position a cutting crew of 12 men so that they moved in sequence without getting in each other's way, how to angle the elevator to handle a late-season harvest when the blocks were starting to soften at the edges, none of that is on display anywhere. It could not be. It was never written down in a form that transferred. It lived in the people who did the work, and when those people stopped doing the work, it stopped existing. The same was true at every level of the trade. The ship captains who knew how to pack an ice cargo, the warehouse managers who knew how to build an ice house that would retain 60% through a warm summer, the ice bosses who knew how to supervise a harvest crew of 200 men moving in different directions across a field of ice without losing anyone through a thin spot. All of that knowledge existed for roughly 60 years, from the industrialization of the harvest in the 1840s to the collapse of the trade in the first decade of the 20th century, and it left almost no written record. The trade journals of the period covered prices and volumes. The newspapers covered the scandals and the price spikes and the occasional spectacular accident. The engineering press covered the machinery. Nobody covered the knowledge. The closest thing to a systematic account of how the ice harvest actually worked, at the level of what the men on the field were doing and how they had learned to do it, is the Scientific American feature from 1884. It runs to approximately 3,000 words. It describes the Knickerbocker operation on the Hudson with the precision of a man who was actually there watching, and it contains more operational detail than any other published source from the period that survives in accessible archives. 3,000 words for 60 years of industrial practice that employed 90,000 men. The gap between what happened and what was recorded is not unusual in the history of manual trades. The people who recorded things in the 19th century were the people with time and education and access to printing. The ice bosses and the harvest foremen and the schooner captains who ran the trade were not those people. They were working men who had learned their skills through apprenticeship and observation, who communicated through practice rather than through writing, and who left their knowledge in the hands of the men who came after them rather than in documents. When the men who came after them had no trade to learn, the knowledge ended. There is a word for this in the study of human knowledge: tacit. Knowledge that can be performed but not easily described. The kind of knowledge that a surgeon has when he judges tissue by touch, or that a fisherman has when he reads the surface of the water for what is below it, or that an ice boss has when he walks the floor of a packed ice house in July and can tell by the sound of his footsteps whether the blocks below the sawdust have shifted. Tacit knowledge does not survive the death of the trade that produced it. It does not transfer to books or to archives or to museum exhibits. It transfers only through the relationship between a person who has it and a person who is learning it, and that transfer requires the trade to still be operating, because the transfer happens through doing the work. When the Knickerbocker Ice Company ran its last large harvest in the winter of 1924 to 1925, the men on that harvest were performing tacit knowledge for the last time. The younger men among them were acquiring it from the older men around them, as apprentices always do in the course of doing the actual work. After 1925, there was no work to do and the acquisition stopped. What Otto Rice knew about ice packing in 1884 was not available in 1930, not in any form, not in any archive, not in any person. It had been in Otto Rice, and Otto Rice was gone, and the notation beside his name in the payroll ledger was the only thing he left behind that anyone still held. Frederick Tudor left more. His business diaries at Harvard are a genuine historical record. They document the early years of the trade with a precision and candour that is unusual for a businessman of his era, partly because Tudor was aware, even in the midst of his early failures, that he was doing something that had not been done before. His diary from 1806, the year of the first shipment, has the quality of a man writing for a future reader as well as for himself. He understood that if the enterprise succeeded, the record of how it began would matter. He was right. It does matter. The diaries are the reason we know as much as we know about how the ice trade began. But the trade at its peak, in the 1880s, when 90,000 men were working it and 25 million tons were moving every year, is documented mostly in numbers. The volumes and the prices and the company capitalization figures are in the census records and the trade journals. The men who produced those numbers are in the payroll ledgers, names beside wage figures, most of them without any further record. There are exceptions. Jonathan Kendall's 1959 History of the Hudson River Ice Trade, published by the New York Historical Society, contains interviews with men who had worked the harvest in their youth and who were still alive in the late 1950s when Kendall was conducting his research. Those interviews are the closest thing that exists to a first-hand account of what the work felt like from the inside. One of the men Kendall interviewed had worked as a pike pole man on the Knickerbocker field in the winters of 1907 and 1908. He was in his late 60s when Kendall spoke to him. His name was not recorded in the published account, identified only as a former harvest worker from Rockland County. What he remembered, Kendall noted, was not the mechanics of the work. He remembered the sound the ice made when a large block broke free from the field. He remembered the cold that came up through the ice surface into the feet no matter how thick the boots were. He remembered the way the light looked on the river in the early morning before the harvest crews went out, when the ice was still undisturbed and the surface reflected the sky. He did not mention Otto Rice by name. He would not have known the name. The ice boss and the pike pole man occupied different levels of the operation, and on a crew of 200 men, the seasonal workers at the bottom of the wage scale had limited contact with the man who managed the ice house. But they worked the same river in the same winters. They were part of the same system. One of them packed 100,000 tons of ice into a wooden building and kept 60% of it alive until August. The other pushed cut blocks toward an elevator channel with a pole for $1.50 a day in a trade that would be gone within 20 years. Neither of them had any way of knowing that the system they were part of would vanish so completely that 100 years later, the most detailed account of their working life that anyone would be able to find was 3,000 words in a Scientific American feature from 1884, a payroll ledger entry in a state archive, and the memory of a man in his late 60s who could still feel the cold coming up through the ice into his feet. That is what 25 million tons per year looks like when you stand inside it. And then it was gone. The question of what happens to knowledge when the trade that held it dies is not a question that belongs only to the ice harvest. It is a question that runs through the entire history of manual labour in industrializing America. And the ice harvest is one of the clearest examples because the collapse was fast enough and complete enough that the before and after are both visible in the same historical window. In 1880, 90,000 men knew things about ice that no one else in the world knew. They knew it in their hands and their feet and their judgment, the way that all tacit knowledge is held. They knew how thick the ice had to be before a horse team could work it. They knew what the surface looked and sounded like when the freeze was right, and what it looked and sounded like when it was not. They knew how to read a January thaw coming 3 days before the temperature changed, by the way the ice moved under their feet, by the way sound carried differently across the field. 40 years later, that knowledge was gone, not reduced, not degraded, gone. There was nobody left who held it, because the work that produced it and sustained it had stopped, and once the work stopped, the knowledge had nowhere to live. This is not a tragedy in any simple sense. The manufactured refrigerator that replaced the natural ice trade was an unambiguous improvement for the people who used it. Food kept longer, prices were more stable, the supply was not dependent on the weather. The iceman who knocked on your door twice a week, charming and reliable, was replaced by a box in the corner of the kitchen that never ran late and never charged more than the agreed price. The 90,000 men who worked the harvest found other work. The trade did not collapse in a single season but retreated over 30 years, giving the men in it time to transition mostly. The disruption was real but not catastrophic in the way that sudden industrial failures are catastrophic. What was lost was not irreplaceable in any practical sense. Nobody needs to know how to pack 100,000 tons of natural ice into a wooden building anymore. The knowledge that otter ice carried is genuinely obsolete. Its loss costs nothing in the economy of 2025, but the fact that it is gone completely and irreversibly is a record of how the world changes. Knowledge that took decades to accumulate, held by tens of thousands of people, specific and practical and tested against real conditions, can cease to exist within a single generation if the conditions that produced it change fast enough. The ice harvest is one example. There are others, more obscure, across every trade that industrialization transformed in the century between 1830 and 1930. The men who could read the grain of a log and predict where it would crack when felled. The ship caulkers who knew by sound whether the seam they had just packed would hold in heavy weather. The blasters who could set a charge in a rock face and bring it down within 2 feet of the intended line. All of it gone, not recorded, not preserved, not transferred, just gone when the work that held it stopped. Frederick Tudor's tomb is in Cambridge. Fresh Pond is a short walk from the cemetery. In the winter, when the temperature drops far enough, the ice that forms at the edges of the pond is the same water as Cruz cut in 1806. But nobody walks out onto it with a measuring rod. Nobody calls the depth on the far bank and walks it back to the shore and says, "Yes, 12 inches, we can start tomorrow." The water is still there. The knowledge of what to do with it is not.